Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today at Human Resource Executives Ask HRE Live Q&A. Today, our topic is COVID-19, leave, and ADA Ask the Legal Experts. I'm Kathryn Mayer, the Senior Benefits Editor at HRE and the Chair of the Health and Benefits Leadership Conference. I'm joined today by some very bright legal minds at UNUM. Very excited about this. We have Ellen McCann, Tamika Newson, and Daris Freeman. All of them are Assistant Vice Presidents of Legal Counsel at UNUM's Employment Law Group. So that makes my job easy with all of your titles. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. How are you guys?
Good.
Great.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Kathryn.
So we are going to dig into some really important questions about legal and compliance issues, all the more important and relevant, of course, with COVID-19 and how that's changing everything and really bringing those issues into the spotlight. And people listening in can also ask questions. So I just wanted to let you know that you can ask questions on the comment section at the right of your screen. So we'll go into those if we have time to address them as well. And without further ado, let's get it started. Before we dive into the different types of laws and requirements related to the pandemic, Ellen, can you give us a high-level view of some of the issues that are facing employers trying to stay on top of compliance and best practices right now?
Yes, Kathryn, and one of the things that I reflect on every day is I've been doing this for 30 years and I've never seen anything like COVID. I don't think many of our listeners have seen anything like COVID. And there's really an increasingly complex regulatory environment that employers are working in. So they're looking at state and federal, local safety requirements, reporting requirements, quarantine, isolation laws, travel restrictions for their employees, telecommuting expense issues, pay issues, whistleblower issues are coming up, and all of these other issues that they've never had to deal with before as they try to determine how to conduct business in the middle of a pandemic. Many employers who are in the non-healthcare space, for instance, are trying to decide what their vaccination policies will be like. They've never had to do that before. So there are all of these challenges, all of these issues that employers are facing. And then you layer on top of that, all of the increased leave laws that we've seen passed that Daris will talk about, and the really novel and complex ADA return to work issues that Tamika is going to talk to us about. And it really makes for a difficult and complex regulatory environment right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, we do have these big legal changes because of COVID-19. I mean, things that we really wouldn't have thought that would have transpired. And we have, the Federal Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which was passed earlier this year and provides paid leave for employers with less than 500 employees as a result of COVID-19. And additionally, there are states and cities have also passed laws in light of coronavirus. Daris, can you go into these changes and summarize them a bit for us to talk about them?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's important to remember before we even go into that there were already some laws in place that employers should have been thinking about when this pandemic started and as it has evolved. You had the federal FMLA and over a dozen state laws that covered just employees who are ill or caring for family members who are ill. So someone diagnosed with COVID may have fell under those existing laws. 3 states already had unpaid leave laws around quarantine or public health emergencies. And then a lot of states had, over a dozen states have paid sick or earned sick laws that covered employee and family member illnesses, but also some of those covered public health emergencies for things like school closures or business closures due to those kinds of situations. So we already had that framework in place. And then, as you said, right, we started with the Federal Family First Coronavirus Response Act. Boy, it's a mouthful, FFCRA. Providing paid sick and paid FMLA for COVID-related reasons for employers that had smaller employers under 500 lives. But since then, states like, for instance, Colorado and New York have passed new legislation that's going to be providing paid leave for COVID-related reasons applicable to all employers. So not just that under 500. Most states and cities are trying to bridge the gap so that employees of any size employer have certain types of COVID-related protections. A lot of the states and municipalities have also maybe amended their existing paid sick laws or earned sick laws, or issued clarifying FAQs. We've seen that as well to ensure that COVID-related absences are covered for those employees. And again, those are applicable to all employers. As far at a municipality level, I mentioned, cities, counties, those, especially in California, there are over 30 different municipalities across the country that have their own laws related to COVID-specific reasons, leave, pay, and at least a third of those are brand new. Some are expansions upon existing laws that were already in place. And then lastly, not that that's not enough to have on our plates right now as employers, but something to think about is the fact that the state legislators are starting to get sworn in and set their agendas and priorities for 2021. And needless to say, in every state, COVID is at the top of that priority list, along with budgets. But we will probably see more as we continue to progress through the next several months.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there's so many things happening right now, and it is interesting when we obviously have, the states do different things, and there's the federal laws. It's a lot for employers to try to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of challenges and things that employers are having to take into consideration and keep up with.
Absolutely. So, obviously, like we just said, this is a lot for employers to figure out. So for those organizations, what should employers be doing right now to prepare for changes related to both the FFCRA for 2021? And then, of course, like you mentioned, there's other people coming into office in 2021, including, of course, President-elect Biden. He's obviously has probably some COVID-related leave plans. Any ideas on what Biden's plans might be? And then also the FFCRA, again, how can employers prepare for 2021?
I think one of the ways employers have to prepare is really to stay involved and stay connected to see what may be happening. So you mentioned we have really two different things we need to keep track of. One is what will happen with the FFCRA. And I don't think anybody knows right now, but this is really something that's changing and happening in real time. Yeah. So just yesterday, a bipartisan group of senators got together and announced that they support a COVID relief bill. We don't know what will happen with that bill, if it will even be brought forward, if it would be adopted. But what I find interesting is in that bill, there's no mention of extension of FFCRA. Now, that doesn't mean another bill won't come forward, but at least right now, the package that's getting the most support or getting the most press doesn't have anything in it to extend FFCRA. So, of course, employers who are subject to that, you want to make sure you're keeping an eye on that very closely, because you could have an 11th hour savior come through and maybe extend that into 2021. But for all employers, including those that are too large to be covered by FFCRA, you really want to get familiar with what President-elect Biden's paid leave plans are, at least right now. I mean, he has a very detailed COVID relief plan that's on his website that does provide for paid leave for employees who are suffering either from COVID, taking care of a family member, or they have a quarantine-related event or a school closure. And his plan provides for 100% of employee pay up to a certain cap. And that would be funded by a federal fund, according to his plan. So employers really want to keep an eye on that and go out, if they haven't looked, go out and make yourself educated on that plan. In addition to his COVID paid leave plan, he also stated throughout the nomination cycle that he supports two other paid leave programs at the federal level. One is the Family Act, which would provide for partial pay during 12 weeks of FMLA covered leave reasons, and the Healthy Families Act, which would provide employees with 7 days of paid sick leave for issues relating to their own health or their family members' health or domestic violence. So he has a very robust approach to paid leave. We don't know exactly what he'll be able to get passed in those different types of topics, but it really is important for employers to go out there, get educated, take a look at his plans so that you at least have some line of sight into what may be coming in the next administration.
Yeah, so that's something that they should think about right now.
Yes, absolutely. You want to, and again, we don't know what will actually get passed or what he'll be able to do, but at least it'll give you a line of sight on what his administration has as a priority and what they'll be working towards as they enter office.
Yeah, and we've obviously talked about having some of these laws and changes as far as federal leave for a while now. And if this does, transpire in the next year, what do you think employers are thinking about that? Is that good news? Is that bad news? Is it complicated? I'm sure for some of them, maybe.
I think it depends on the employer, honestly, and what their current philosophy is, what their resources are, how hard COVID has hit them, what industry they're in. I think there's really a mix of philosophies out there towards paid leave. One of the things that I think we've seen in our clients and folks we've talked to is many employers felt as if when COVID hit, their leave policies were not robust enough and they were not nimble enough. And so even employers with really good policies knew there were gaps. And a lot of employers have taken time this year to add to their policies, expand them. They feel as if they're in a better place, but they've also importantly seen the need their employees have for paid leave and for some protection. So I think a lot of employers' minds have changed over the last 9-10 months over the value of paid leave, but there are a lot of employers who honestly, they've had a hard time keeping the doors open and staying in business. And so they look at this and say, although we would love to give our employees more paid leave, we might not be able to afford it. And so there's just really two schools of thoughts, I think, here. And I know, Daris, Tamika, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well as you talk to customers and clients as well about what their struggles are.
Yeah, I think you summarized it well, Ellen. That's exactly it. I think for our larger, more stable clients, right, they're looking at how do we expand our existing leave programs, wanting to provide paid leave where appropriate without going overboard. But yeah, those smaller clients are really struggling to keep the doors open, where they may not have as much coming in because of the pandemic, right, from a budgetary perspective. And then they're also trying to provide leave to their employees that may have issues for themselves or family members. So it's definitely a challenge. And I think the industry matters, the size matters, the state matters, right? A place like California, they've got a whole lot of different challenges maybe than they would have somewhere in the Midwest. So
I think that's absolutely true as well. There's a lot of compassion, which has been encouraging to see on the side of the employers. Everyone wants to do the right thing and wants to do right by the employees, but they've got businesses to run. And so all of these considerations get compacted with everything Ellen and Daris just mentioned.
Yeah, those are great insights. It's been really interesting to cover the industry and, talk to employers and HR leaders, which I do a lot, and hear about what they are doing, even, aside from even the laws. And I love what you just said, Tamika, too, about the compassion piece of this. It is such, it is so important right now. I mean, more than we've ever seen before. I think that there is that empathy, that compassion piece that, maybe we haven't seen as much in the past. And leave is certainly a big part of that, as far as, people getting sick or taking care of their kids or, their parents or themselves. So it's really fascinating to see kind of, what we're seeing right now. And Tamika, I think next question, to go back into some of those, the legal side, the compliance side, can we talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, or, the ADA, or other accommodation type laws? What do those laws require, and what kind of guidance are we seeing from agencies like the EEOC?
Definitely, as if there weren't enough out there, with FMLA, FFCRA, We also have to add the ADA, all these acronyms that employers are trying to figure out how to navigate. I think the main thing to remember about the Americans with Disabilities Act is that it hasn't been changed. There's nothing that's new or different in the actual regulation themselves. But what the EEOC has done is they've probably provided us more guidance than any other federal agency about how to deal specifically with this pandemic and with the return to work and employment issues that are happening concurrent with this. So the EEOC has done great. They've interpreted the ADA. They haven't changed it. They've just interpreted it for employers to let them know some basic questions about what you can do in terms of employment testing. Before the pandemic, we weren't allowed to take medical tests for employees and temperatures and report medical information to other agencies. But the EEOC made it very clear that this pandemic would be a direct threat, which is a concept that's always been written into the ADA. But when there's a direct threat to the workplace, there's certain things that employers can do that they wouldn't ordinarily be able to do. And so that is one of the things that the EEOC has done. They've done a great job of letting us know what kind of changes we can make in the workplace that they believe would be consistent with the ADA. Another area that, we had no idea what to do with, that the EEOC cleared up for us, was what to do with people who have these underlying conditions or, pre-existing conditions that make them more susceptible to COVID, who don't want to come to the workplace. But technically, a lot of them didn't fall under the ADA's standard definition of disability that would be covered. But the EEOC put out guidelines very early on that said, if you can accommodate these individuals in the workplace or outside of the workplace, we recommend that you do so. And this is just guidance that's helped employers throughout the process. They've updated their guidance probably, I think, at least 4 times now, as late as November, to let us know as the changes are happening, as now people are returning to work, what should you do to prepare for people to come back to work? Another issue that's come up quite frequently is, if we did make telework accommodations for people during the pandemic, do we have to keep the telework accommodations, or can we make changes to that? And so the EEOC put out guidelines saying, if the person can't fulfill all of their essential functions at home, you don't have to allow them to continue to telework. But they've given employers throughout this process a lot of guidance about how to go about navigating these employment waters. So that's a kudos to the EEOC. They've done a great job with that part of the process. It gets more difficult when we talk about state accommodation issues and laws, because in the process, we've got lots of states that have been also enacting, and I won't say laws, because a lot of these come out in the forms of governor proclamations or other local type legislation. But ultimately, employers have to stay on top of that as well and make sure that they're following whatever guidelines that their states are providing. So it's been a massive endeavor to keep up with all of the different types of regulations that are out there and how to navigate the waters. But from my perspective, the ADA and the EEOC have been the most consistent in providing advice and feedback about what to do and how to stay on top of this from an ADA perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. That's some great insight. And you kind of touched on this. What about return to work specifically? That's obviously this really big piece that we're seeing. People are really trying to kind of figure out what best to do. So what are the requirements? And do you have any ideas on best practices on how to practically do this? Because that seems like a really big animal for employers right now.
It is. It's tricky, right? And timing is tricky, because just as soon as you think we're kind of good to come back, then we have a resurgence and you kind of question, what are we doing? Does this make sense? And every workplace is different. The one basic guideline that I tell everybody is just make sure you're following OSHA and CDC guidelines as closely as you can, because that's just the best start. But there are other practicalities that are just going to depend on the workplace and the environment. And, I'd love for Ellen to kind of go into some of the things that we've done at Unum and some general principles, because I think she has a great perspective on that.
Great.
Right. And I think, Tamika, that situation you just described happened to us at Unum, like many other employers. We, sent everyone home virtually overnight, and we have close to 11,000 employees. And then we started working on what we called our reunite plan. So getting some people back in the office safely, and securely, with social distancing and all of the other CDC required protocols. And we actually communicated to our employees that we wanted people managers and above to come in at least a couple of days a week. But then we just saw everywhere across the country, the virus just started to spread even more. And we saw an increase in states that hadn't really had much exposure, such as Maine, where we have a very large location. And I give our senior leaders a lot of credit. They looked at that and said, maybe this isn't the right time. So even though we had already rolled that out, a lot of work had gone into it. They took account what the national and the local landscape was for the virus and said, no, employees, no one has to come back in. It's your choice. But at the same time, we have cross-functional teams that meet every single day to look at this from a variety of different angles to make sure we're not only compliant, but that we're providing a safe environment for our employees. And so that people who do want to come in the office and work can feel comfortable, and we know we're protecting them. So you have to be nimble, you have to be cross-disciplinary, you really have to not be married to your plan and be willing and able to move as this virus moves, because none of us, again, have ever seen anything like this. Hopefully we'll never see anything like this again in our careers. And even the CDC has had to change their guidance along the way because this was so new. And so staying on top of that and being willing to respond, I think, has been a key to at least our success as an employer in how we have handled this and how we've continued to be able to do business during this pandemic.
That's great. That's great to see. I think, being nimble is such a big lesson that I've been hearing a lot about too from, from people in the industry, is just really, and also just kind of sympathizing and understanding what employees, would like to, if they want to come back in the office or if they don't, because it's just a very obviously unpredictable time. Speaking of being nimble and, understanding some of the pain points, we had an audience question, which is, if someone is out sick because they believe they have COVID, but the test comes back negative and they've been out of work for over a week, what point does FMLA kick in? So many really interesting logistics right now.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think, the question, it says they were out sick. So I think the first step is to figure out, even though they tested negative from a COVID perspective, did they actually have some kind of illness, even if it wasn't COVID related, right? Because the FMLA threshold issue for the federal FMLA is that they have to have an illness, injury, or some kind of mental or physical condition, right? So if they weren't sick at all, you have no FMLA component to think about. If they did actually have some illness, just not COVID, then it's a matter of getting the appropriate documentation from a physician. And I know, especially during the early stages of the pandemic, that was a challenge. So maybe telehealth thing, if that test came back negative, did they at least document or validate some kind of illness that employee had? So, it's a matter of applying the standard FMLA provisions and requirements. But I think the other piece of this is some of these COVID laws do provide for paid leave for employees who have been ordered isn't the right word, but a healthcare provider or even their employers have asked them to self-quarantine because they may be, maybe they were exposed to COVID or they have symptoms that are COVID related. And so even if the test comes back negative, that kind of precautionary quarantine while they get a test is covered under a lot of these state COVID related laws. So FMLA is one piece, but employers are going to have to look across the board to see if there's something else in play for them, even if that employee had no illness at all, but was precautionarily quarantining until they had a negative result.
This raises another question I think I'd like to just point out for that a lot of employers really do think that FMLA and or ADA coverage are linked to a positive COVID test. And that's a misconception, because a positive COVID test doesn't necessarily mean you're sick or you're disabled. We all know that there are people who have no symptoms at all and are still positive. So that's something I would like to just take out of people's thought process, because if you start with the notion, is this person sick, then you can answer FMLA and ADA type questions. Like Daris said, there are still other regulations that may apply that allow these people to have leave or pay, but it might not necessarily lie within the FMLA or the ADA.
That's a really good point. I think, again, I think it's just something that's just been so unprecedented, where that's something that a lot of people would assume. So to clear that up. Another good question, I think, and one that helps kind of wrap things up a little bit for us is how can employers stay on top of all these? Obviously, we just kind of went all over the acronym soup, ADA, FMLA. So what can they do?
I wish there were a really nice, easy answer to this, and I wish someone had this global consolidated database that we could all go to and use and, push the magic, the easy button. Unfortunately, there's not an easy button on this one. As Ellen and Tamika can attest to, you're pulling from a lot of sources right now to stay up to date. So there are some law firms out there, some really good employment specific law that specialize in employment law, that are doing a couple of things. Some of them have published COVID related guides that list all the laws that have passed so far. I cannot promise you that they are all exactly up to date as of today, right? So, but it's a good place to start to see what may be out there. Those law firms also do email alerts related to COVID, so get on their mailing lists, right? Get on, Tamika and Ellen and I can attest, right? We get an email box full every day from all these different law firms, and a lot of them may overlap, but then sometimes based on where those law firms are situated or where they have large offices, you may get some information specific to a jurisdiction that you won't get from another firm. So those are good places to start. Also, always check your state and local government websites. I think everybody has a COVID specific page now. So look there when you've got a specific issue with an employee to see, is there something required in that particular jurisdiction based on the circumstance. And lastly, at a federal level, the Department of Labor for purposes of the FFCRA, the EEOC for purposes of the ADA, and yes, I think I threw in like 4 acronyms in one sentence. They all have really good, robust websites with FAQs and scenario situations that can help guide employers. So those are really good from a federal perspective. And the only other thing I would say is I don't want to say open-minded, but anything employment law related may touch this right now. So for instance, don't get so focused on leave and looking for a quote leave law that you didn't notice that California passed some OSHA guidance that actually embedded some leave provisions in it, right? So you're going to have to take a really broad brush as you filter the information coming out on employment laws to make sure that you're capturing everything that may have passed or guidance that may have been issued. And to Tamika's point, sometimes it's an executive order or a governor's statement. I mean, it's coming from all over. So it's really getting on mailing lists, and finding the resources for your jurisdictions. And I don't know, Tamika or Ellen, if you have anything else to add. I know we're all plugging in where we can.
I would say just one other thing is make sure you're going back to your sources as well. I mean, one of the things I've been doing for Unum is helping support all of our quarantine for our employees, our contact tracing, all of that. And I actually have in my calendar twice a week to check the CDC website and meet with my HR partners, because you don't always get an alert when the CDC makes a change. Sometimes you do. If it's a big change, you'll get an alert. Sometimes it's just a minor change, and you have to know what that says, and you have to be up to date. So put alerts in your calendar for the most simple things. just to make sure you don't lose sight of something as simple of what are the most common and current symptoms of COVID.
Right.
That has changed many times over the course of this. What are the quarantine recommendations? Make sure you know what they are and don't assume because you looked last week, you know what they are. You're going to have to look again because they're changing so quickly.
Absolutely. I think we're at about time, but we're going to sneak in one final audience question that we got, which is, do you anticipate companies providing an increased number of sick days in 2021? That is an interesting question. Any insight there?
Well, Ellen, I'm probably going to ask you to answer that just because I know supporting Unum HR, we're looking at our own policies and how, and working with other employers from a best practice perspective.
All right, I think we've done a few surveys as well here. Oh, getting my hand the wrong way. Surveys of our clients as well. I can't figure it out because I'm backwards on the thing. Anyway, so we have, this is good for a live stream. And what we're hearing from them and what we're seeing in the surveys is that employers are anticipating that they will go ahead and increase those numbers for next year.
Yep, I think that the fact that a lot of people were off work for long periods of time and no longer qualify for FMLA because they didn't meet the 1,250-hour requirement is making employers consider adding sick days just to, again, be compassionate and make sure that there's plenty of time so that people can take care of themselves and their families.
Yeah, good point, Tamika, that FMLA issue. It's coming up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And I think, again, we are at about time, but thank you all so much for these wonderful insights. I know it was helpful to me and obviously to everyone listening in. And I do want to mention that Unum and HRA actually does have a webinar coming up on December 10th, which is called Building a Leave and Absence Strategy for the Future. So obviously that goes in perfectly with what we just discussed today. So for anyone wanting to check that out, we definitely encourage you to do so. And again, thank you to all of you on the panel. This has been great. And thanks to everyone also who tuned in and watched this afternoon. We hope that you certainly stay safe and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.